yesterday. Here.
Am I audible? All right. Send me. Sorry, let me put on my timer.
Hi, I'm really sorry. Can we just hold on for 10 seconds? I think there's some problem with my internet. I'm just reconnecting. Yep, all good. Sorry for the delay.
All right. Can I just check again if I'm audible? Okay, sorry about that. Starting in 3, 2, 1. OG is going to show to you that we have lots more people housed on our side of the house. Weird. That we ensure that fewer people are kicked out or priced out of areas they currently exist in. And then you have a variety of like miscellaneous exogenous economic benefits that come from added development in such areas. Notice our arguments will apply both in the developed and the developing world, but I think the developing world is also crucially large actor just because of the size, because of the number of vulnerability, and because of how many places are overcrowded, and it's currently facing lots of cities like Lahore and Karachi, which will have very high price increases. I want to note here that stuff like environmental impacts are largely not as important as the economic benefits and the benefits of getting a house and not being on the streets, or of just not having to pay as much in rent. I will show to you, because these people are largely poor or coming from the middle class, probably value this more than the other thing, especially in that sense that's more long term. But secondly, the main contributors to like environmental damage, stuff like big corporations, the way they produce and things of that sort, are largely symmetric on both sides. So I don't think any this sort of minimal environmental damage will really change things, even if things become a little more smoggy in the worst case scenario. Notice why prices in these areas are currently rising. They're rising for a simple reason, is that more people want housing or want to live there for whatever reason. Perhaps because there is no other housing or other areas. Perhaps because that area is central to their workplace, or perhaps because it's just very nice for other reasons. But generally, there's an excess demand for housing as opposed to supply. The reason we want to fix that is to increase supply to ensure that we cut back on this rise in prices. What is our model in that case? Like health and safety standards obviously would still apply. That's not an argument off can run. But we will be fine with, let's say, building bigger buildings and like taller flats and apartments so that more people can be housed there. We'll be fine with fucking over parks and then constructing buildings and so for that there too, insofar as we get more housing or more property development as a whole. First argument: why do you get more investment and hence more supply of property development or housing and things of that sort? It is far more profitable, given that most of this development is done by corporations, housing corporations who really sell it to tenants or landlords or things of that sort. They largely care about making the most amount of money from that area. Why do we allow them to profit off this more and then have more investment and more supply? One, you can now have far more returns insofar as you just need to buy a singular piece of land and you can build a 100-story or 50-story apartment there, rather than simply having to be restricted on the residential housing laws and only having 3 stories there. Because of that, you can make lots more money, and it also allows you to charge a more competitive rate per apartment. Two, insofar as there's an excess demand to supply, corporations probably already want to invest there, but they're unable to because areas of land are called environmental areas, parks, and you're not allowed to invest there. We give them that capacity and ability to increase supply, given there's already an incentive because the signaling factor of higher demand exists. So they see a demand, they want to fulfill it to make more money off of it. Three, costs of production are likely to be much less on our side of the house, insofar as you don't have to worry about spending too much on the more expensive, eco-friendly means of production. Insofar as you don't have to spend on lots of money on beautification or painting your apartment a certain way or having it standardized. All of those costs are saved, which is why far more investments likely to happen insofar as corporations see that they can benefit off of this more and the profit margin for them can be larger. All of this means a lots more investment and lots more construction and building of houses and more commercial property there. Why is that important? Why is supply of housing so important? The first thing I'm going to argue is that even if the new housing is only bought by the rich people, taking opposition at its best, it is still beneficial because these people right now were in fact increasing the the price of current housing by bidding for it, by trying to buy them off because they wanted housing in that particular place or they wanted a particular property. If new supply exists, these people can instead buy the new houses that are built or buy the new apartments or the new thing that we are providing. All of that means that the demand, or rather the disparity between demand and supply, goes down. So overall, there's less pressure for prices to go up. That is especially crucial when you consider lots of people live on rent, lots of people have landlords, which on opposition side of the house who have been incentivized to sell off their property because the prices are going higher, or give that give that particular flat to someone else who's willing to pay a higher amount of rent. Insofar as those someone else's go to a different flat or have other alternatives to choose from, there's less pressure on prices, there's less demand, and hence landlords and all can't simply kick people out or force them to pay higher rents. So people aren't forced to pay higher rents, which they probably can't afford in the first place. And these are likely to be poor or middle class families, maybe not abject poverty, but because these people lived in that area from the start. It's just because prices have started rising now doesn't mean everyone in that area was rich from the start. For lots of people inherited properties there, lots of people have been living there for decades. These people can then continue to live without having to pay such exuberant increases in rent or being kicked out of on the streets because they can't pay that rent in the first place. The second thing is, trivially speaking, insofar as there's a greater supply of housing and things of that sort, there is just fucking more space available for people to be included there. Maybe not the absolute poor, but people from the lower middle class and middle class can get more access there. Often corporations build very small apartments within the flat and they don't have to care about that anymore because it's profitable, because they can house more people there. So lower middle class families can actually get access. Often landlords will buy these new additional flats and apartments and rent them out. Insofar as there's more competition for flats and so on, people have a better idea as to where to choose flats from. And so if there are more flats and more landlords competing to try to lower rent and ensure that they attract the people coming in, the prices of this are likely to be less, which means more people can afford it and more people can be included in this process. Before I go on to why this is so important, CEO.
Places like Mumbai, go on.
At a point of time in places like Bombay, which probably have rent control invested and prime pieces of realty with rich people, why will they leave that and go to unprime places just because now they'll get better facilities?
These aren't probably unprime places. I mean, insofar as prices are rising there, means people actually want to house there, middle class or upper middle class, but there is clearly a demand there. So obviously, if you provide the supply, people will house themselves there. This is important because then now people don't have to either pay exuberant amounts of rent or be priced out and have to shift somewhere else where they'll be further off of the central area and have to pay a daily transportation cost. But this is also important for external economic benefits. Stuff like, trivially speaking, if there's more investment because it's more profitable, you have lots of hired labor to actually build those apartments in the first place, to actually ensure that you have that commercial development. And lots of people get jobs because of this, which is extremely important considering most of these people are unskilled and this amount of money is actually enough to put food on the table, especially in the developing world context. But also, insofar as investment happens here more, there are just trivially speaking more amount of people that are living in that particular area, which means demand for products on local businesses or local shops improves drastically, which means these people do better off. They're probably going to hire more people to help them out in their shops and local businesses. They're probably going to open more shops in local businesses, which is why whenever you have more people settling in a particular place and you can house them better, more development and more investment happens there, which obviously, trivially speaking, leads to more such things like taxation that perhaps Ashar can talk more about. We give more people housing, but crucially, if we even don't that, we ensure that they aren't priced out of their places, and there are lots of economic benefits exogenous to this. So proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much for that. Hello.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah, just give me 10 seconds, please. Anything else? Gentrification. Just setting my timer. Yep, starting in 3, 2, Notice we claim that the laws that they claim about gentrification sector being stopped in status quo are simply untrue. Why? The current zoning laws sector, the most that they do is restrict commercialization. Can you not hear me? Let me stop my timer. All right, let me continue then. The most that happens right now is the stoppage of commercial buildings being built in the residential houses. That is the maximum amount of restricting that zoning laws currently do. They do not have yet to say that they'll introduce some new laws to stop gentrification. Because notice in status quo, when there are restrictions on places you can build, there are empty places in which these companies, especially these building companies, are able to gentrify even more and more, so that more people can come in, because there's very few houses that they can actually sell. So the idea is, if they can only sell to extremely rich people, then they have to make stuff really, really sexy and good looking so that rich people come in and buy. When you're selling more small apartments, when your housing is specifically designed such that you're not expecting the most rich to come in, but rather your goal is to sell to the more middle class people, you focus even less on gentrification and you focus more on building as much as you can so that you can sell it significantly more. Notice in this world, gentrification, even the incentive to make it happen becomes significantly less, and there's more chances of gentrification happening in ops world. But also notice the three safeguards they give are completely the three safeguards they give don't work. One, politicians will do this to protect the poor. Notice how politicians have an incentive in literally every single way to support the poor, because they're always a part of the voter base. That doesn't necessarily mean that the politicians will always necessarily bring up pro-poor people policies, right? Why so? In this instance specifically, because the government can simply shrug off by saying property prices rising are a naturalistic event. Even more importantly, often governments are able to get away with pushing the burden on like landowners and whatnot. We think the government best is able to help the poor not when it takes a step back, but when it actually makes efforts into making sure that there's greater housing in which the poor people can actually live. But also notice that the other two safety mechanisms they have of poor people protesting are unlikely to work. Why? Because often the laws that are built right now in status quo protect the landowners and all, which means that even if poor people protest, the more they can actually do if they manage to collectivize in a way where they're able to leave jobs and all and still manage to collectivize, the most they can do is perhaps halt construction for a couple of days in high pricing areas. We don't think they're going to be able to keep that up for a very, very long time. I don't think this alternative works. Also, this last idea of politicians just want to like keep giving them the capitalist dream. The capitalist idea is this, that there's a free national market, just keep working hard enough and one day you'll be able to afford whatever house you currently had to leave. So I don't think any of the mechanisms work. So then what then becomes a comparative, because both sides are claiming they want to give poor people more housing. Why are there simply more people living in our world? Notice in our world, when there's simply a greater amount of houses being constructed, on the flip of it right there and then, you obviously have more people being able to live. But importantly, as in give you analysis, that the rich people coming in now have alternatives to live if the poor people who are already living don't get crowded out or removed. Notice why this is so important. This means that if there's greater alternatives for rich people to move in, and if rents don't rise at the same amount of place, there's less and less poor people that want to move out, that are forced to move out. This becomes essentially important because corporations would rather build in new places where perhaps park sector existed before than break down old buildings and construct new ones, because simply construction prices in these regions are much, much more higher. This means that landowners in current situations will have fewer people to sell their land to if corporations have other places in the same area they can build. What this means is that landowners have a lesser incentive to go out and like make sure that their tenants or like their rent people sell out their houses so that they can just sell it to a greater corporation. What this essentially means is that less poor people are forced to move out. But also notice, when there's greater alternatives, even if these people are forced out, there are alternatives within the same region for these poor people to shift to if there's greater amounts of housing. Now, why would poor people really want to stay in the same area? Not even poor people, like even if it's middle class people, why would they just really want to stay in the same area? There's three reasons why. One, most of these people have housing, education, their jobs, everything constructed around the areas they live in, especially if it's an area where prices are rising. That generally probably means it's an urban center and whatnot, and job sector are easier to locate here. Two, if the price of this particular area is rising, what is very likely is the price of the areas immediately surrounding it are also rising. What is that to say is that the alternative, if you have to move out of this area, isn't just moving somewhere slightly far away, it's probably somewhere which is significantly far away. What that means is that the prices sector and the prices of like transportation, the price of like just being able to afford schooling, etc. All of those things just significantly increase elsewhere. But thirdly, notice how just moving and shifting out is an extremely expensive process, especially in an economy like right now, when moving out, having new rent deals, buying new property and all becomes even more and more difficult. Notice in this position, being forced to be crowded out, not just because rents are rising, but also for property owners. If taxes rise, if the price of like land taxes goes up infinitely for these people, it becomes much more difficult for them to be able to sustain their places. What we would rather have is a lot more buildings being constructed where there's greater amounts of final total tax coming in, but not individual tax rising to such an extent where people would just have to be forced to move out. But notice where this becomes extremely important, especially because then the comparative is of where do poor people have more jobs. But before I move on to the second great impact, I'll take a POI from closing. Theo.
Yeah, hi. In terms of removing environmental regulations, will you go ahead and destroy Central Park in New York and build buildings there?
Yeah, if it comes down to it, like we're good with removing parks and whatnot. Like I think Yasin already clarified that I don't think Central Park is going to be removed. So like I think that's quite an extreme alternative of proper landmarks being removed. I think they'll have to do significantly much to prove that. But yeah, notice on this idea of economic goals, right? Notice opposition also wants like jobs to exist, like they say in the analysis, but why do jobs significantly increase in our world? This is a hot place of rising property prices right now. What is to say is we want to capitalize at this moment. We want a lot of construction to happen. This is why we want greater amounts of housing and larger buildings and all to happen, because we think that necessarily means more construction, more jobs within this particular business. But also notice, once you remove the zoning restrictions that exist right now, especially with regards to commercial buildings, commercial areas being built in like residential areas, we think in those areas specifically when these small businesses etc. open up, because there's a demand for them in these areas now, especially if there's a lot of small housing that exists, we think there's a lot of economic activity that happens. There's a lot more business opportunity for people to come in and improve the economy and just don't really contribute to like taxation and whatnot. But that doesn't stop here. Small businesses etc. coming in, and generally this becoming an urban center means that there's simply more and more investment into the kind of small jobs that don't exist in status quo, and there's more opportunities for people to come into the urban center to be able to do these jobs. But not only that, jobs existing in these urban areas also means that the people currently living in those areas have more and more jobs nearer to them. What is that to say is that the life for these poor people right now, which might be crowded in opposition's world, becomes even more easier. We don't think environment significantly changes through the slightly increase in crowding, because these people still have to remain within the city no matter what. The alternatives of moving out of the city aren't possible. All of those reasons, open government.
Okay, thank you for that, Diallo.
Can you hear me? Okay. No one in this debate is contesting that to some degree, property prices will likely fall on the opening government side. That is the assumption behind the motion. The question is twofold. One, is this the only way that we can solve the problem of housing prices? Two, how should we weigh the value of lower housing prices against all of the other harms that are likely to occur? Because I think that's where the relevant debate happens, and that's why opening government doesn't enter. That's why I think they're out of this tournament. First, how do we solve the problem of housing prices? The central OG claim is this is the only way. This ignores all of the explanation that NC gave you for other ways that we already use quite successfully to limit the extent that housing prices are going to rise. The first question that she asks is, must people really live in that single area? And she tells you that what we can do is encourage diversification of economic opportunities. In South Korea, for example, there's an active effort to build other centers of economic centers outside of Seoul to reduce the extent to which people flock towards these major cities. She tells you that even if we can't remove the extent to which Seoul is a center or London is a center, you do things like build transport links, right? Even if it's far away, I think to the degree that Gov claims Fiat to radically change regulations on that side, we also get Fiat to be able to suggest other alternatives as to ways in which you can reduce the extent to which people have to live within the city. The conclusion here is, I think living in the city to a large degree is somewhat convenient rather than a necessity. If we are able to make this less of a necessity, we are also likely to be able to get a decrease in housing prices, which means that we also solve the problems the opening government wanted to solve. But finally, there was no actual explanation for why things like rent controls and rent rights for tenants cannot work. They claim that when there's more housing, you have less ability to evict your tenant. That ignores the fact that evicting a tenant is fundamentally illegal in the first place. And therefore, they are arguing that regulations currently don't work, and yet they need that regulations clamp down on how buildings so much that they need to be removed. Note how this is internally contradictory in the opening government case. You have to reasonably conclude that we currently have some degree of ability to protect the poor and to protect housing prices, which means the question is not will housing prices go down, it's how far will these prices go down in ways that are exclusive to that side. And to the degree I think we've proven to you that this is not an absolute benefit on that side, then you must conclude that you must weigh these housing prices, the marginal improvement in housing prices, against all of the other harms that we talked about in opening opposition. That's the meta of this debate that LUMS was not willing to engage in. How, therefore, do we weigh the value of housing prices? And there are two questions I want to ask. The first is who really benefits, right? Because the core argument that we gave you was that rich people have the maximum ability to buy up this housing in these areas. We need to understand the context. This is not a discussion on how we get more jobs to the area, for the simple reason that if prices are rising, that already means that there is existing demand to live in the area, i.e. things like a lot of big companies are already in the area, meaning that the benefits of jobs, for example, are just non-mutually exclusive because people presumably move into the area, they eat lunch in the area, that's how it gets expensive. So there's no comparative on that side. The problem is therefore that on that side, when you have more property, it is incredibly unlikely to me that you will buy a prime plot of land and then you will price it at a price that poor people or middle class people can afford, if it is true that rich people want the convenience of living within this area anyway. Given that these corporations are profit and construction companies and developers are profit motivated, they are likely to set the price as high as possible such that they are able to attract the highest degree of the most premium customers. The conclusion, therefore, is that to the degree that what they actually protect is individuals' convenience on that side, they are still likely to get the problems of poor people being priced out relatively, because even if they bring the prices down slightly, it is unlikely that it is significant enough that poor and middle class individuals are able to enter, as opposed to your rich investment banker who gets a housing allowance and stipend from his company. Therefore, if they don't really benefit the poor, who benefits the poor? Enzi tells you that in the status quo, the laws we have exist to protect the poor. They protect you on who can stay there, or they protect poor people who already stay there, who own hereditary land or own council land within the area that they've stayed on even from before this gentrification occurred, or even from before the degree of investment came in. Notably, DPM misses the point of all the analysis that Enzi was giving you. She was not telling you that we will suddenly have new regulations that protect the poor. She was telling you that that the regulations that exist to protect the pre-existing landowners within this area who are the poor. And she gave you explanations for why there is an incentive to keep these regulations there, because the government does need the political support of the poor. The problem is on that side of the house, when you remove these regulations, they can't say that the same incentive structures apply, because you can't just remove regulations and then put back some regulations to help the poor, because that inherently cuts against the degree of housing price reduction that they want. They cannot have their cake and eat it too in this debate. It's incredibly frustrating. The conclusion you must draw, therefore, is that we have some degree to keep these regulations that protect the poor. They say a couple of things in response to this. The first thing they say is that you can build anywhere, but you can't take out the poor. I think this ignores the degree of their benefit, right? It's not like the poor will be able to stay there, because what happens is that these rich developers just rush into the area. And sure, they might not confiscate the land of the poor, but what happens is that the degree of gentrification that exists reduces the bargaining power of the poor on that side of the house, which means that at the point that a bid is made for that property, developers get to lowball because they know that poor people desperately need this money. They cannot afford to stay in the area anymore. That therefore reduces the extent to which poor people get fair and just compensation for their house. Things like electricity bills rising, the cost of living, right? The higher investment around the area, all of this means that you hurt the ability of the poor to negotiate a good position at the point that they're trying to protect their house or get fair money for their house. Then they say, you want to try to make housing on that side of the house. Look, I think protecting property for the poor is just a regulation they can't defend, because it cuts against things like access, because keeping poor people in these areas who are the least likely to spend will minimize the extent to which they get jobs on that side of the house as well. The conclusion you should draw, therefore, is that poor individuals are likely to be hurt on that side and helped on our side, whereas rich people benefit on both sides of the house. Next question, therefore, are economic benefits the most important? There were two important things Enzi tells you. They get literally no airtime from that speech, and I think it's horrific. The first is the idea of speculation. She tells you that ultimately bank loans are based on the money of the surrounding buildings around that particular development, which means that you are more likely that their policy increases the degree of bank loan that exists. That's their mechanism, but the problem is that this likely leads to speculation. There was no explanation in OG why this wouldn't lead to the kind of speculation that exists. Just note the degree of harm that we suffered during the Asian financial crisis as a result of these property bubbles, right? The fact that banks collapsed. developers collapse and go out of work, millions of unemployed or poor blue-collar individuals who are in the construction industry are the ones who lose out here. And so even if they benefit the rich in the short term, or the middle class in the short term, the degree of harm that they're going to incur at the point that the economy goes to shit is significantly greater on that side of the house. But secondly, we told you about environment, and this was incredibly important. The only thing they say is that there's no significant change because big corporations exist. One, that ignores the reality where we're moving towards green building because we recognize the degree to which these urban areas are hurting the environment in the status quo. But secondly, the problem on that side of the house is that they change our norms away from protecting the environment because they create a norm that a short-term marginal decrease in housing prices is worth trading off the environment. It is unclear to me why this doesn't sink into the way in which we conceptualize of the environment as something that is easily traded off for other economic benefit. This is incredibly important because it affects our future generations who don't consent to the problems that they want to create in the status quo. And those are things that we think we just cannot defend. We are proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that. And to open the closing half, Member of Gov.
Hi, can I be seen and heard? Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. OG argues why market economic forces of supply and demand will reduce the prices of houses. And we agree to a large extent why this is something that can happen and why this is something that's good. Over and above that, in CG, we will argue why having access to an actual affordable housing and development is an inherent right. We're going to detail the problem that poor individuals in urban areas face, but most importantly, why they should get access towards houses in urban areas over and above the alternatives the opening opposition sells in this particular debate. All says they want to protect the poor, but the poor people that they seem to be talking about in this particular debate seems to be poor landowners. And by definition, if you're a landowner, if you own a house or a condominium or have the ability to sublet your unit out to other people, by definition, you are not as poor as people who don't have this capacity to do so. We think that the most vulnerable people in this particular debate are people who do not own any form of capital, people who do not own the houses and do not have the ability to rent their houses out to other people. More importantly, because these people don't own houses, in many instances, they are forced to rent these houses and condominiums from rich landowners and then are subject to all the abuses and oppression that we think OG hints at, but we're going to ground in this particular debate. 2 points of extraneous rebuttal before moving to the one question that I have. The first is that regarding the asset bubble in that opening opposition said is something that's so important. The first thing to point out is that just because you increase the quantity of houses in a particular area doesn't necessarily increase the speculation. What it means to say is that just because we have more houses, and perhaps because demand is quite high, because demand for houses is quite high on both sides of the house, it doesn't necessarily mean that the speculation on the price of houses is something that's likely to increase. The extent to the analysis is just that in opening opposition. We think it's quite likely that individuals on the ground are likely to be able to assess market forces of demand and supply quite accurately, especially given the fact that post the subprime mortgage crisis, people are a lot more careful and a lot less likely to want to invest in things people are a lot less likely to be subject to things like asset bubbles because of the subprime mortgage crisis that had happened in the past. Secondly, also, we can implement things like financial regulations, so capping the limit or property prices, speculated property prices in a certain instance. We also think there was a lot of political capital to implement things like this post the subprime mortgage crisis. The conclusion of this is an asset bubble is very unlikely to happen inside of opening opposition. If it's true that it's sourced by demand, it still exists in OPO and therefore is symmetrical. The second thing then with regards to environmental protection, just simply will say that your duty towards your current generation of individuals right now is a lot more important than your duty to future generations, because people are affected by these policies right now, and we will suggest that it's more important to provide actual shelter and housing for people that exist now over speculative people that may not even exist in the future. What this means to say is that if we have to choose between people now and people in the future, we would prioritize economic benefits now because we don't understand why people should suffer in oppression and poverty and gentrification or in order to protect a generation that may not exist in the future? There's one central question I will answer in this debate, and that is, where should we provide affordable housing? If we can show that urban areas provide a significant number of benefits towards individuals, we are thus able to show why it's important to provide access to those urban areas, and therefore we win this debate, edge out opening and the opening exchange, because they don't talk about this crucial impact. I'll take OO later. OO says, so first question, OO says they don't support centralized urban development. We think that the trade-off you make here is extremely harmful because you're systematically locking the poorer people out of getting access to capital in urban areas. We would suggest that in many places, development is centralized in urban areas. You get things like access to healthcare, things like access to education, infrastructure, technological hub, equipment. These are not available in suburban or rural areas precisely for the fact that this development is centralized in those particular urban areas. The reality is that in most developing and developed world, development is centralized because it benefits companies to work in proximity to each other, and they also want to be located close to skilled labor as well as getting access to infrastructure, right? So if you build your company close to a road, it's easier for you to work because your workers can travel to your workplace as compared to the alternative. If OO says they don't want to centralize development, or they want to push their development and housing areas outside of these urban areas, necessarily you are locking the poor out of having access towards these benefits of living in urban areas and getting access to capital. The best alternative we get in opening opposition is like if they say they want to provide things like transport link, and like understandably in Singapore it may not be that big of an issue, but the reality in many different places of the world, places like Manhattan, places like New York, traveling from suburban areas to urban areas can take more than an hour. Like in KL, for example, in the jam, it can take 2 hours for you to travel from PJ to Bangsa. All these things mean that it imposes a cost or a barrier of access that poorer individuals necessarily cannot afford in this particular area. The conclusion of this is we ought to provide access to increase development, because in a world where poor people do not get access to things like jobs in the cities, they're unlikely to be able to increase their quality of life and get access to a specific jobs that are only available in the urban area and only available for them to improve their lives in those areas. OO then says, regulations improve and protect the poor and confer power to the poor. The first thing to point out, this is ridiculously untrue. In the status quo, rent is increasing and going up. These regulations and rent controls that opening opposition say they can implement don't seem to be working, given like they have been implemented in the status quo and they just aren't working. The reason for this is because landowners hold an absolute position of power over and above those people, their tenants who are renting land, who are renting houses from them. The reason for this, when gentrification happens, landowners have the ability to kick like the tenants out of their houses now, and they like, even though they have agreements, the reason why tenants don't always have a lot of ability to recourse is because when you go to housing court, for example, number one, these tenants who are relatively poor don't have the ability to pay the legal fees and actually get the rights they deserve. But secondly, these landlords have a lot of power with regards to capital, with regards to money. That means to say that they have the ability to kick these tenants out. These tenants are in a position of vulnerability because the houses they are renting is the only source of shelter and the only source of livelihood that they have. At the point where they lose it, they are forced out into the streets, and in some cases, it actually does happen in places in the US. That's why tenants don't have the ability to hold these landowners accountable. And that's why those regulations that were supposed to protect the poor don't necessarily work. If like opening up says they want to get like the incentive to prevent protest is something that prevents politicians from like, for like incentive for politicians to protect the poor. It's just unrealistic. It doesn't happen within the status quo, given the fact that so many poor individuals have been kicked out of their houses on the street. Politicians just don't care because landowners are rich and have the ability to lobby politicians. We think financial capability almost always overrides the democratic right of like individuals on the ground to like access things like recourse, and that's why it's worse. The slums in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, and Mumbai are homeless people who've been kicked out. People in the US are living in their cars. These are all harms that shows why it's inherently necessary for us to provide the right to shelter for these poor individuals. The people who live in urban areas are relatively rich and privileged. They want to protect the perception and value of the property, and this is why they don't want to have poor people in those areas. It's an entrenchment of privilege and locking out of access of capital for poor individuals. That's why it's an inherent right for us to increase the number of houses and protect those individuals. Proud of propose.
Okay, thank you for that, Member Vault.
I hope I'm audible.
Yep.
Cool. I'll start in 5 seconds. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Bangalore is going to run out of water in 2021. Mumbai is going to run out of water in 2030. We don't understand what OG and CG are trying to trade off to the extent that these cities are literally going to be uninhabitable, to the extent that a lot of these regulations literally protect the kind of environments that make these cities even inhabitable for the various people they want to contest this debate for, be it the poor, be it the rich. This is the actual trade-off within the debate adjudicator, and this is where we're going to win this debate upon. A few things I'll do in this debate. Quickly, I'm going to take out the premise that opening government pushes on you in terms of pricing, give you better alternatives as to how we can achieve that without even removing regulations, and then tell you why it's a bizarre idea to even do that. Secondly, I'm going to take out CG's bizarre claim about, like, well, whatever it was, and then going to extend on two effects. First, why we need to prioritize these regulations, especially pertaining to those that, like, especially safeguard environments. But secondly, why the kind of responsibility you want to put on government is one, not just to like have people come into urban centers, but also spread out these urban centers so much so that people aren't dependent on these particular hotspots to come and make a living. I'm a person who lives in a poor ass state in Bihar in India, and I literally have to leave my family and go to live in Bombay to actually make a living. This is bizarre. And to the extent that these like things that 3G and OG offered are like literally going to exasperate that problem, we think it's something that you need to condemn. A few things then to rebut OG. First, the claim is that you're going to like remove, like you're going to like, you know, balance out the kind of pricing issues that there exist within houses to the extent that you have private players and corporations coming in and making houses. A few things. First, we think public housing is unlikely to come because the point at which you remove these regulations, the only attraction you have is that there's more money to make and less money to invest simply because, you know, now there aren't as many regulations. But secondly, notice what really draws people to these urban centers to come and like develop, especially places like Mumbai. And I'm sorry if I'm using too many Mumbai examples, but whatever, is the literal fact that these are places that draw high prices. The reason Mumbai, even after rent control and a lot of regulations have been removed, is still fucking expensive is simply because builders and private builders aren't willing up to give on the kind of control they have on the pricing, and they don't want to do so because it's literally easier. But look, let's look at how private players anyway play out to the extent that a lot of builders were bailed out within India in 2007 after like a premature housing crisis was coming through, and none of them went away and gave housings to myriads of poor people who were taken away in these like kind of schemes that opening opposition also wants to kind of talk about, right? We think there are also like chances where the kind of land and the plots that these people like that OG and CG are talking about building are probably just going to be owned by other richer people who already own a lot of land and comfortably go and live in places like Dubai and New York and whatever, never really ensuring that the benefits permeate to the poor. We don't think that's something that realistically happens. But secondly, if the claim is that, if the claim is that removing regulations is going to fix everything, notice that it doesn't necessarily do that. Have a bureaucratic mess that creates red tapeism and corruption, because of which a lot of these places, especially within developing countries, are still relatively expensive. But the problem decreasing these regulations and not ensuring that there are standards that these buildings is that you try to cut corners and like cut the costs that you have, literally making just like uninhabitable for a lot of people to live in, but also fucking over the kind of environment that there is around those people, literally making ghost towns and ghost buildings like that we see in Middle East, starting to see in like cities like Bangalore and cities like Mumbai literally as of 2020. We think to that extent, this makes consumers incredibly unhappy, acquiring space that isn't meant to be filled by a lot of rich people who don't necessarily live there, which means that the benefits that opening government and closing government talk about, you know, we're going to give housing to poor and all of these things don't necessarily happen because, you know, this is not entirely bought, this is not entirely bought by these people. But look, just because you want to make sure it's like some sort of like, because you claim that there is some sort of an affordability that stems out of removing housing, doesn't mean that's inherently a good thing. Because we don't think that the fact that you might not be able to breathe the air in cities like Mumbai and Delhi simply because, you know, well, it's not breathable anymore, but also more importantly, because like these are places that are depleted, like these are places that are depleted to such an extent that it directly damages your cause it directly damages the standard and the comfort of living that you're going to live in. Exactly the way I was talking about how you cut corners as a builder if you remove these regulations, when you go on to destroy the air quality or the water pool simply by, increasing the population that there is within these regions. So yeah, we concede that the fact is, at the end of the day, these high prices mean that a lot of people don't probably come and live in these urban centers. But we think that's inherently good, because more people living in these urban centers end up making these places a lot uninhabitable because of how they drastically alter the environmental landscape. How they drastically alter the environmental landscape within those places. But look, if the idea is one of these must be prioritized, notice that pricing and a lot of things can be prioritized, and there are viable alternatives, and I'll give you exactly a minute. Except environmental degradation affects everyone, and that's literally how absolute liability works, to the extent that there are some things we hold absolutely valuable, such as the environment, and we don't think there's any reason to make any concessions on that. Secondly, how we can make things better, even if OG wants us to say that pricing is something we can do, right? First, elevators are the new form of public transport. That literally means one of the ways you can do it is removing floor spacing restrictions. That I'll take OG in 10 seconds. Yeah, is removing floor spacing restrictions while also having certain restrictions, ensuring that there aren't as many violations of the violations of environmental law. Secondly, I'll take OG. Yeah.
This debate isn't about abolishing tenant eviction laws or pricing laws, as that isn't under property development laws. And it's also quite rich to tell poor people that they can fuck off and not have a job just because you want to make smog better. Why is it responsible on that?
Okay, let's not make poor people live in polluted environments either. But here's the thing. First, you can have better housing. Secondly, you can literally remove commercial and governmental blockades. To the extent a lot of plots within urban areas are also owned by governments and commercial houses and they are no longer used for residential purposes simply because these people don't have the permits to do so. But lastly, we think also what you can necessarily do, something that opening oppositions kind of hints towards but doesn't really tell you, is development of satellite cities, where cities are spread out in a way that urbanization also spread out. There are multiple benefits of this. First, you don't overburden the cities, depleting the natural resource pools that exist there anyway. Second, spreading out of urbanization and commercialization permeates benefits to everyone, making sure that you don't necessarily have to move to urban centers to actually have a job or actually have any commercial benefits. But thirdly, notice that the land, especially the poorest of the people who live within the land, are a lot protected when you don't have multiple people coming in from everywhere and hounding on them simply because there's a lot of prices in building those lines. Think of coolies and fishermen in places like Mumbai. But lastly, why is this a better idea, right? First, we think this is a lot more viable alternative to the extent that this takes care of a lot of people. My people deal with this. But secondly, we think it's inherently sound, the fact that government takes upon responsibility to help these people, including those that are homeless and including those that need this housing help. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that, Govwood.
Just give me a bit. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do in my speech is to explain why I think that we won over the opening house first in terms of government. So I think that we provided you quite an important extension. We told you about how necessarily accessing these houses is an inherent right that individuals ought to be allowed to access, and understanding other regulations have failed, which I'll go into later on again. I think that it is of utmost importance that we make sure there are more houses within these areas that are generally more accessible to these people due to two reasons. One, there are unique opportunities that exist within cities, especially already existing cities that do not exist outside of these areas. The important impact here that we provided you is that you should not lock poor people out of these opportunities and entrench these geographic regions of privilege that these systems have previously entrenched. Two, people who are already there are literally being kicked out onto the streets, having to live in their cars, having to be move out of their houses forcefully because there's a power asymmetry that exists between landowners and tenants, even within these areas. I think at the end of the day, these individuals who do not have their rights protected ought to be prioritized. The first side of the house from opposition that I'll tackle is site closing. So the first claim that they had was, what about the environment, right? These responses will also tackle the material. DLO sneaked in on the environment near the end of their speech really passionately. So I think that there is a lack of link coming up from side opposition as to why a government ought to prioritize the environment more than the immediate well-being of people on the ground right now who are currently being evicted from their houses or locked out of these areas. At best, what CO provided was to say, but the environment matters insofar as it affects long terms of generations of other people. But at the end of the day, I think that there's a greater urgency in protecting these poor people from being kicked out of their houses. Why? Because their literal well-being right now in the status quo is being entrenched. Also, there are a variety of other alternatives that exist in order for governments to be able to protect some level of environmental well-being without environmental zoning, right? If you look at these same rising houses areas where people are privileged, you literally see housing developers building trees into their buildings in order to make sure that they're able to compensate for the environmental quote-unquote destruction in the worst case that they've created. I think because of the fact that we have developed to a point where individuals and the government can enforce other ways in order to protect the environment, not just within these areas, but I think in general, I think at the end of the day, the environment needs to take a step back compared to the direct well-being of the people on the ground. Additionally, as TJ has already pointed out to you, I think there's a greater priority in protecting people who are already alive and existing right now and not having their livelihoods protected compared to a potential of people being born and being grown into the environment. I think that there needs to be a way of priority, and that priority needs to be settled onto the people that exist on the ground. But the second claim that they made, which was a little bit smaller in terms of the extension, was in terms of ghost towns, right? Realize that these ghost towns exist because there are no opportunities there. People move out of these areas and move into the city. This debate needs to be about urban centers, but there are opportunities. I think at the end of the day, property in ghost towns is a lot less important than property in proximity to development in order to ensure people to access these things. I'll go into a little bit more response as I tackle OO next, because I think that they said a lot of really messy things that made the opening house quite messy. The first thing that they wanted to talk about was about a bunch of other alternatives, right? So the question then becomes, are these other alternatives to solving this issue good enough? Note that the reason why this debate is happening is because those regulations have not worked, and that has led to this exponential increase in housing prices. And I'll tackle this on twofold. The first is in terms of alternatives that look like putting price ceilings or rent controls. Putting a price ceiling on the price of housing clearly has not worked if the prices have continuously risen and pushed the price ceiling upwards to a point where people cannot access your houses. Similarly, if the alternative is rent control, realize that these haven't worked either, insofar as there are many loopholes that people can exploit in order to obtain and charge higher rent, charging additional costs upon tenants that are unrecorded within official documentation because they harp on the tenants' desperation to stay in the city, splitting up singular homes and renting them out to multiple tenants to collect a larger amount of accumulated rent. More importantly, realize that if it is true that OO concedes that individuals are as privileged as they are and have so much power to push out these poor people and middle class people from accessing anything within those areas politically and economically, I think it is also reasonable to believe that these individuals have the ability to run away from accountability when they evade these rent controls in the worst case. At the end of the day, I think they need to be a little more fair. If they want to say these people are privileged to a point where they can control some things, I think they also have the ability to control others. TJ also pointed this out when he talked about lobbying. But the second response I had was in terms of other alternatives such as satellite towns that both OO and CO wanted to talk about. The logic is you either buy over houses and land areas from poor communities to make satellite towns, or you just make satellite towns somewhere else within non-urban areas. We don't think this is a good alternative either, considering how exploitative it often is to those vulnerable people. One, you literally have poorer individuals who have owned their mother's house for decades being forced to sell off their house because there were little protections from their time of ownership, and because the prompt of money is huge from these privileged housing developers or house owners. You have people who have to move out of these poor communities but end up moving into other poorer areas, concentrating poverty into specific areas and leaving these newly developed areas empty, like the ghost towns that CO talks about, or again, non-accessible to poorer people. which ultimately also leads to the entrenchment of privileged geographical areas that we do not want. Because you not only lock the rich people into certain areas, you also push the poor people out of those areas into other areas as well. But even if this was untrue and a proper establishment of satellite towns is possible, I don't see why housing developers, who they characterize as profit incentivized, will invest in random poor areas that their privileged customer base wouldn't want to enter either. At best, they can assert housing developers will do it to obtain a middle class poorer market, but that also directly contradicts the premise of their argument about these developers always catering to these privileged people. At the end of the day, they cannot win this either. I'll take one from CO, sorry.
Huh?
CO.
Okay, yeah. How does one country take care of the desecration of forests when homes aren't built in one day, and literally destroying the environment also leads to destroying of multiple sources of finances of people like fishermen and all because of water pool like reduction and stuff like that?
Okay, so you look at where most of these like environmental areas you want to protect are. They are in your rural areas. They are in your non-developed areas, because that's where the environment is left behind, right? Compared to the skyscrapers in your city. So sure, maybe we demolish Central Park and we build a building there, but like you also protect other areas. So if your satellite towns are infringing on those areas, they hurt the environment and comparative more environmental harm on your side of the house. The last thing I want to point out is, will people still be able to live within these areas? Realize that there are already middle class and poor people who already live within these areas and want to work there. In that regard, I think there's already an ability for people to live there up to a point where housing prices increase. Post this point, I think individuals are less likely to be able to live in these areas, considering their house literally costs twice as much as they did last month. Or business owners who have shops in their area charge more goods insofar as they also live within these areas and have to pay their own rent. I think at the end of the day, this premium label exists as these house prices continue to increase to a point where people cannot access them anymore. And beyond the demand supply analysis from OG, I think the link of importance drawn from TJ's speech about why individuals have the right to be able to live their lives in these areas and not be locked up by the birth lottery is particularly important when it comes to the way out, especially in the closing debate, because of all of those reasons. I think we take this debate. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. And to close this entire house, Upwit.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll just set up my timer. Yep. Perfect. Three, two, one. Look, in this debate, we recognize there's a problem. But the solution, if we go ahead and consider that you have termites in your house, is not that you go ahead and desecrate the whole house and then go ahead and rebuild it. But to go ahead and focus on that specific problem, which means this debate boils down to two crucial questions. Number one, at a point of time when your policy doesn't solve the problem effectively, even when it solves it, that is to say the consideration of cost and the amplitudes of harms that it's going to go ahead and take place, that is the entire government. And number two, when it goes ahead and creates a new problem, making it and bringing you to again back to square one, because now you still have now more problems to go ahead and solve. And this is where the closest we have come is with respect to CG, where they just trade it off but doesn't recognize the harms that continue to exist. At a point of time when cities like Cape Town have run out of water, it really doesn't matter whether poor can go ahead and have a housing there at a point of time when they can't literally survive there. I'm going to go ahead and continue in this debate. I'm going to go ahead and deal with CG first, then OG, and then differentiate ourselves with OO. Notice CG's contribution in this debate has been in terms of rebutting OO as opposed to going ahead and fleshing out new extensions. And I think that's the only fair way to deal with that. Let's begin with the most important aspect that they bring in this debate. They go ahead and segregate the kind of poor that live in the status quo. That is to say, they make distinction with poor landowners and the poor people who probably stay on the rent. Notice if the distinction exists, these poor people who stay on rent are the ones who often and always don't have things like purchasing power parity, because their sources of income income are extremely limited, which means that even if the even if the private corporations goes ahead and build these stuff, it's unlikely as to they'll be able to go ahead and purchase it, especially at points of time when they go ahead and categorize things like COVID exists, when jobs are being taken away in the formal sector and the impact on informal sector is undesecrated. At that point of time, they don't engage with the contribution that Shakya brings in terms of minimum support price. Notice that cities are the commercial hubs. That is, if you exist or have housing, and that is why you go ahead and buy houses in forms of investment, which means even if you're never going to go ahead and stay there, but the idea that it's going to go ahead and give you returns is the reason. Even if it's empty, I'm going to go ahead and let it exist. At a point of time when builders and private players know this, it's unlikely why they're going to go ahead and enter and sell these houses for the less than the profits that they probably would have. It is not economically sound. At that point of time, the assumption that carries from side opening government to this debate is that there is going to go ahead an accrual of private benefits, because now private corporations have built the house, hence they'll have to sell it. We demolish that. But then the only principle that exists is that they assume that private corporations go ahead and exist for helping for public good. Notice what happened in the aftermath of 2007, and this goes ahead and takes care of the impact of the strategic responses that CG wanted to go ahead in terms of that people and corporations are more careful for. You went ahead and gave them bailouts, and those bailouts were given on the condition that it has to help the consumers in order to go ahead and make sure that they can make rent. Nothing happened. All these bailouts did was able to go ahead and to the pockets in terms of the increasing remuneration of the top of the corporation, and they never translate into the bottom feed. At a point of time when you go ahead and give carte blanche to private corporations to desecrate an environment, to go ahead and pour concrete on the land for their private interest of going ahead and earning profit, I'm unsure as to why that is going to go ahead and take place. And this is where the most important contradiction that goes ahead and take place. Notice the alternatives that we give you in form of deregulation, that is to say, in terms of, say, floor spacing index, or because right now the floor spacing index in cities like Bombay is 1.5, even though it could have been like as high as 150 because it's colonially archaic and hasn't been revisited to, is something that goes ahead and builds houses by taking environment into consideration, which is a form of deregulation that we are fine with. We also go ahead and argue that at a point of time, and this is extremely crucial, because notice the policies that they have, which is to ab initio removal of regulations in their world, can only happen when they have acquired land to begin with. Shakya told you why your ability to acquire land is probably limited, because a government has classified certain spaces as commercial, which is to say that if you have factories that goes ahead and exist in the middle of the city, is something that private and government corporations can't go ahead and sell you even if they want to, which means that they can only go ahead and continue to build the lands that they have or acquire from private players who can sell you without taking care of the environment. At that point of time, I'm unsure as to what the larger impact is. Then the only notion is, we are going to go ahead and build away the central park, and if that means that it means that more people get to stay. And here is the deadlock. O tells you that we should care for future generation. CO tells you that we should go ahead and care for the current generation. We don't think that this straw man exists in this debate, because at a point of time when a large chunk of people are moving out, so say during COVID, when people had to set off migrations and move from these urban centers to rural centers, they took the resolves in terms of not coming back, because the jobs that they go ahead and get is just not worth the cost in terms of health, in terms of the asthma that they get because of the pollution and rising levels of cities, because it doesn't have green urban spaces, because it doesn't have water, which means that you get diarrhea because you use the bad water. At that particular point of time, the straw man doesn't exist, because current people value housing as much as environment, because there is no a priori distinction between environment and housing. Both are equally important. OG.
You don't have yet to say you will somehow get $1 million transport projects made in time to get fringe area access to urban jobs, on which the immediate livelihood of these poor and middle class people depends. Given that you're saying the environment is already destroyed, what is the marginal change you bring?
Notice this is a straw man again that they go ahead and build. In order to build commercial and complex housing in urban cities, the buildings that they want to build takes years and half a decades to go ahead and build. At that point of time, please don't buy into this straw man. Time is something that goes ahead and takes. But even if the trade-off exists in terms of time, notice that we are fine with going ahead and letting go of certain houses if we are able to go ahead and build them rightly, because there is no value of building them at a point of time when they aren't done rightly. At that point of time, notice, and this is why at a point of time when development takes place and we are able to deregulate and we are able to go ahead and make sure that like FSI is taking place and new construction can take place without giving it to private corporations, employment benefits still continue to exist. At that point of time, why should we take this debate over OO? Notice OO gets in a deadlock between poor and rich, which is a possibility on both sides, but it's not a probability. At a point of time when we go ahead and tell you why poor people should have a life with dignity is the only constant that continue to exist. We mechanize their attributes in terms of the deregulation that they talked about by specifically telling you what it is and how lives become better. At that point of time, we give the mechanization to that generic case. Extremely proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that, debaters. So please exit this Zoom room and we'll go out and let you guys know when the verdict is ready to go. Okay, thank you for the debate. DG here.
CG is here. My partner has some connection issues, so she will.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we can proceed.
Okay, so it seems that everyone is here. Can I proceed? Okay, cool, no problem. Okay, so Sarah's, the other Sarah is is right now working on something with the Edge course. So I'm gonna proceed with the OA first. But if there are any questions that you would like to address in regard to the verdict or the justification that we reached, feel free to also reach out to her after the OA. I'm gonna have my camera off just because it seems that that's a little bit more convenient for the connection. But yeah. All right, cool. So thank you for the wait, everyone. Obviously, we thought that this was a very good above average debate, and we made sure that that was going to be reflected in the speaker score. So first, I'm going to give out some general impressions of what I felt about the debate, some areas where I could definitely see a bit more improvement and grounding, and second, the verdict, and third, the justification for the verdict. So I have 2 points in terms of where all teams in the House could have done better. I think for this particular debate, there could have been definitely a bit more dissection and clarification on what specific regulations are being lifted and are being discussed. So obviously the motion slide and context does say that it's not about health and safety, but I think there could have been a lot more analysis on what is the relationship between environmental pollution and health, and how does that understanding necessarily chip into this debate, or how does that interplay in this debate? I think that idea or argument was something that was elaborated as the debate did progress, but I felt that those clarifications could also be a lot, could have been better off a lot clearer from the very get-go, and that's something that Sara and I also discussed in terms of breaking off some tiers in our discussion. But the second point is that I think it also would have been a lot beneficial if teams could spend a bit more time differentiating the difference between possibility versus probability, because I think there were some moments throughout the debate where teams would argue that certain benefits or harms would happen without further spending an equal amount of time or more time to prove why that benefit is not just possible, but a benefit that is more likely to happen. So I think it could be a better practice for all debaters if there is more time and if we're dedicated to actually proving the probability of something as opposed to the mere possibility. So those are two main areas of feedback or comments that both Sara and I felt about the debate. So for the verdict, we felt that this was an opposition bench win. We gave the first to opening opposition, second to closing opposition, third to opening government, and unfortunately fourth to closing government. So I'm gonna go from bottom to top, from fourth to first, and compare why each team took the ranking that they did. Also just an additional note, Sarah and I both had quite clear first and fourth, but we spent the most of our deliberation time breaking the tie between the second and third for for CO and OG. All right, so let's start from closing government. So I think coming from closing government, I think the major problem coming from this particular team was that although there was good analysis regarding, the general incentive structures around urban development, gentrification, or even the idea of why it's inherently wrong that rich people can simply kick the poor people out of urban areas, although those ideas were good, we felt that generally those were already well substantiated coming from opening government. The bulk of the case that CG explained about, we felt were rather well mechanized coming from opening government, especially in terms of how the housing prices actually go down and would become more affordable for the poor people. Also, CG does discuss about why OO's regulations will not work, but we felt that the argument rested at the point of, how current regulations will not work, but it felt a bit dismissive of OO's further dissection of how there are other alternatives that will work, and also their fiat of how the same political capital or resources can be used to revamp these measures like transportation links, commercial hubs and satellite housing or whatnot. So I felt that at best, CG was able to maybe tackle down one element of the counter proposal or the idea coming from OO, but not so entirely at the end of the day. So the only viable case that we felt was fair to credit closing government for was this entire idea on why, on the environment and how the current generation and its immediate needs right now must be prioritized. Although that was a good case, we felt that it didn't take up a large bulk of the case, but more importantly, we think that CO did a pretty good job of breaking down CG's premise on why environmental sustainability is not just a long-term benefit, but one that has to be done and dealt with now. And CO also further provides how, the current generation's quality of life and how the current generation's livelihood is also directly locked in as a result of environmental degradation. And that was quite sufficient in us being convinced that CG's premise of environment being a long-term issue was broken down. And that's why the viable case that was coming from CG unfortunately was also knocked out by closing opposition. In comparison to closing government, what we thought opening government did well was provide a lot of the core materials that happened on the gov bench. For example, OG lays out, the characterizations of the developing world, how the market mechanisms of housing prices work, and what kind of incentive structures are, going to change after. But most importantly, OG talks quite well about the benefits that arise out of this particular motion. And the examples that they give are things like small, medium enterprises, family businesses, more employment, local business, and whatnot. We felt, both Sarah and I felt that those arguments were good, and those were initially very convincing. But with the pushback coming from opposition bench, unfortunately, those mechanisms became a bit less convincing as opposition's case progressed. What do we mean? What do we mean by these things? So I think what OO and CO also in an element do well in terms of pushing back is they provide a better or more convincing mechanism of how even the expanded houses or even the expanded properties would be more easily bought out by the rich and private builders. And, they provide a lot of analysis as to why that's more likely to happen. And the reason why we thought this was important was because it broke down OG's essential premise that housing prices going down will actually benefit the poor. The problem with this at this point was that many benefits that OG outlined, like local businesses going well, employment, enterprises, and all those things, albeit good and virtuous benefits they were still contingent on the premise that these housings or lower housing prices will benefit and return to the poor. So the moment that opposition as a bench is able to break down that mechanism, hence the premise, we felt that a lot of the ideas coming from OG were left not so substantial or not so valid at the end of the day, at the end of the debate. Then in comparison, I think what CO is able to do better in comparison to OG is, two things. I think first in line with opening opposition, CO is able to, talk about why the lack of affordability is still going to happen. And they also add to the point of OO on how opening government's policy will not work. Initially, Sarah and I thought that this could be considered as derivative, but there were some unique points that we thought were important in at least tackling down the OG. And that second point was what CO was able to do was consider why even in the best case scenario of opening government, that even if poor people do get the housing positions or do get the expanded properties, CO is able to prove to us how even these cities and expanded housing for the poor, or the city environment in general, will be very inhabitable. And we felt that this was important because even if Sarah and I gave the benefit of the doubt to opening government on how their mechanism does get grounded and how their mechanism does actualize, CO was able to prove why even that benefit is no longer that meaningful under the under environmental degradation and whatnot. So in that sense, I think what CO was able to do better compared to OG was provide those unique points that finally ended the case coming from opening government. And CO further takes out or further grounds this idea about environment that was left off as a trade-off coming from opening opposition, but CO further grounds that by saying why environment is not a trade-off and why it's a right or why it's something that should be protected right now. But why do we think that in comparison to all the other teams, why did we think that opening opposition takes today's debate? We think that there were two things. First is that while opening opposition concedes that mechanism of OG is going to happen, that housing prices will go down, I think OO provides the clearest comparative for the debate on how the debate is more about comparing the marginal improvement in the lives of people and how that weighs against other potential harms that are borne by it. And the way that they do it is by better dissecting how the actual incentive and operational structures of the rich and privileged work. And we thought that this was important because it turns over the premise of government side that this policy will not work. And we thought that this was critical in terms of invalidating many of the benefits that were hinged upon the validity of that premise. But the second thing that they do better and well in this debate is really provide to us good structural incentives as to why these regulations have to exist. And at this particular level, they provide us with a good principle level justification as to why these regulations have to be safeguarded, but also furthermore, they go into more practical reasons why these things have to be safeguarded. But another thing that they also do along this line of logic is they admit that even if the regulations that are in existence right now may be insufficient or may not be perfect, why they're able to fiat the political capital and resources to revamp other measures. And they also provide further analysis under each satellite housing, commercial hubs, and transportation links to provide to us why there are viable alternatives that can be sought instead of this particular motion. So in that sense, we felt that the other teams in the debate may have been able to question the inefficacy of the current measures and able to question the inefficacy of some elements of the whole counter policy or whole model that OO was able to give out. But at the end of the day, a lot of their casting of doubt was insufficient in terms of overturning both the principle and practical validity of the model that opening opposition was able to give. So that was that was basically how Sara and I saw the debate. And we feel very comfortable with the rankings that we're able to arrive at. So unless you all have any questions to address the general house, that would be it. And thank you for all of the prelim rounds and best of luck to you for the break announcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we reach you on Discord for personal feedback?
Yeah, of course. Approach me through Discord or Facebook for further feedback on your individual speeches or whatnot. But thank you.
Thank you so much. We're approaching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the debate, everyone. Thank you for the OA.
Yeah, likewise.